Hey, Al. Well, welcome everyone this Tuesday for a SWAT Talk with David Hochschild, class of 1993. Today's SWAT Talk is a special Mother Earth Month themed SWAT Talk, which gives rise to climate, biodiversity, and environmental justice topics. If you're tuning into a SWAT Talk for the very first time, I'm glad to share that SWAT Talks are a production of the Alumni Council. And tonight's talk owes special thanks to Jason Zengerle and Mike Dennis. The Alumni Council's intention with the SWAT Talks is to create spaces of connection and conversation for, by, and featuring SWATties. That seems like a little too much SWATty. I'd like to remind you on the Alumni Council, we literally keep it SWATty down to the socks. If my Lucretia Mott socks were not in the wash, I'd be wearing them right now. Before we dive in, a few housekeeping rules. Tonight's talk will feature David giving a brief presentation followed by a Q&A, including questions for is chair of the California Energy Commission. It's a state agency with over 700 staff and a multi-billion-dollar grant budget whose aim is to manage energy policy and planning in the great state of California. Now, even as states and local governments are the laboratories of democracy, and David and his work are exemplary of that, it's worth noting that California, for a country by itself, would be the fourth largest country in the world. Or the fourth largest economy in the world, and David sits at the helm of its decarbonization and electrification plans that leads the country and beyond. So it's a great pleasure to have David here, especially given that it's going into his 30th reunion year with us this evening. David, over to you.
Well, thanks so much, Saba. We can never have too much SWATty, so appreciate the opportunity and welcome to everybody. I'm David Hochschild. I graduated in 1993, and just by way of introduction, I remember I felt like a lot of my classmates were highly directed about what they wanted to do with their life. A bunch were somewhat directed, a bunch were somewhat undirected, and then there's me. I had no earthly idea what I was doing with my life, and I bounced around quite a bit. So I want to just begin with a little bit of my journey, how I got into clean energy, because after Swarthmore, I worked construction. I, took some inner city kids on outdoors trips and various other things, but I really was bouncing all over the place. And then my father, who's a journalist and kind of sensing his son was all over the map, invited me to join him on a trip to South Africa in 1994. Nelson Mandela had been released from prison and was campaigning for president. And I said, of course. So I went with my dad to South Africa. This is just at the end of the apartheid era, and had an extraordinary experience and decided to go back and work there. Mandela, of course, came out of prison in part because of the pressure from divestment, and Swarthmore was, of course, a very active participant in that. And it was an extraordinary time to be there. I was living in a township in the Eastern Cape, the Port Alfred township of about 30,000 people. This is 1996 when I was there. Mandela was president at this time. And actually, my first real exposure to solar power was in this township. One of the first things that the ANC government did when they came to power, they put solar-powered postal stations in the townships all over the country. So solar and batteries that had lights on, and for the first time, there was actually postal service, mail service at the townships, which they had never had under apartheid. And a little light went off for me about the possibilities of solar then, and that actually I think kind of helped me go down this path into clean energy. I really had the most extraordinary experience of my life. I was in this region where they speak Xhosa with the clicks, which is that's Mandela's native tongue. And this was a program that he was the head of, which actually was a sort of youth training program. So coached basketball, taught writing, and really I'm just so grateful for that moment. Went on from there, went to grad school, and then went back to my hometown of San Francisco and decided to get into local politics. Worked for then Mayor Willie Brown, who was a very colorful character. A famous story about Willie Brown: he was the only mayor of a major American city that I know of, who kept his home phone number listed in the white pages. And one night, this woman calls him at 3 a.m. to complain that her street light is out and can he get it fixed? And he does get it fixed. And the next morning, he sets his alarm for 3 a.m. and calls her back and says it's fixed. So he had a wicked sense of humor. He was very colorful, very lively mayor. At that time in 2001, we had, much to everybody's surprise, a power crisis, and there were rolling blackouts. And so we had, in the middle of the day, for weeks and weeks on end, the power was going out. We didn't know at the time what the cause was. We now know it was market manipulation from companies like Enron, that were creating artificial shortages. But there's always an opportunity inside crisis, and I think about this a lot. My wife is Chinese, and my kids went to Chinese school, and I was always interested in the Chinese word for crisis, Wei Ji, which is comprised of two other words put together, danger and opportunity. And there's always opportunity inside a crisis. So we got together, a number of us, and put a ballot initiative on the ballot to do $100 million for solar panels on public buildings. And this is November 2001. I teamed up with a good friend of mine from Swarthmore, Adam Browning, class of 92. And we ran this campaign, grassroots ballot initiative in San Francisco, and it passed by a vote of 73% in November of 2001. We got solar panels on the roof of the Moscone Convention Center, San Francisco Airport, San Francisco City Hall. And Adam and I, he'd been at the EPA and I was in the mayor's office. We both decided we were just really excited about leaning into clean energy and into the prospect of helping take solar power from being one of the most expensive and smallest sources of energy in the world to help make it the lowest cost and largest source, and it's well on its way to that now. So we decided to start an organization to do that, Vote Solar, which is over 20 years ago. Adam and I co-ran it together, and then he went on to run it himself for almost 20 years, just retired last year from that, and working on barrier busting for clean energy policy. So 100% clean energy standards, net metering, interconnection, rate design, incentives, and tax credits to drive solar and clean energy mainstream. And the organization now has about 50 staff working in 25 states. I went on from there into the solar industry, and then ultimately got appointed by Governor Jerry Brown to the California Energy Commission, which is the state's energy policy agency. We have about a $9 billion budget now. We're pushing all sorts of clean energy technologies, energy storage, electric vehicle chargers, and so forth. But the main thing we're trying to do is get the state to 100% clean energy and then electrify almost everything. And so today in California, alternative energy is the wrong word to use to describe renewables. Actually, fossil is alternative today. And the Governor Gavin Newsom, also former mayor of San Francisco, signed legislation in September that accelerates our target. So now we're required to get to 90% clean energy by 2035 and 100% by 2045. About 21 states now have 100% clean energy mandate, and President Biden has now made that the goal for the country. And that's, for me, one of the exciting things about working in California, is that because we're such a vibrant economy in a state of 40 million people, we can be sort of a giant incubator for the clean energy industries of the future and the clean energy policies of the future, and really socialize and scale these up. So one of the bedrock policies for energy in the United States is efficiency. It's the power that you don't use because you are getting more efficient device. And interesting story. So California, which is in blue there, basically tracked with the rest of the country on energy usage until the mid 1970s. And then legislation was passed that created the Energy Commission, which has the authority to set unilaterally very strict energy efficiency policies. And here's what happened. We create all this industrial and commercial and residential energy efficiency savings, and now we're using about 30% less power than the rest of the country, which is, I think, a really great example of really what the role of government can do and the savings that come from that. We're in a period where I think government often gets vilified, but this kind of thing saves a huge amount of money and pollution. This was actually the first appliance that we regulated, which is a refrigerator, which was the largest user of energy in your home. And up until they'd never been regulated. And in 1975, the first regulations went into effect. And this was the energy use of refrigerators at the time. It had been going up and up. And the refrigerator industry said, we're going to go out of business if you regulate us. But we put the efficiency standards into effect. And here's what happened. The energy use went way down, but the price of the refrigerators also went way down and the size of the refrigerators went up. I think this is, sort of a poster child, again, for what effective public policy can look like that has real benefits on reducing emissions. We've also done a lot of efficiency for appliances that you don't think about. So your television, which we did in 2009, we basically say to the TV industry, you cannot sell your product into the California market without meeting these strict efficiency standards. And we cut the energy use of televisions in half, saves $1 billion a year for consumers. And again, because we're such a big state, the TV manufacturers typically do not want to manufacture one product for the California market and one for the rest of the country. So in many cases, they end up upgrading their whole manufacturing lines for all of North America or even all the globe. So a very high leverage thing. And things, you don't think about like plug-in chargers. So you have a cell phone or a shaver, and up until 2012, you'd plug those devices into the wall. And when they're fully charged, they're actually still drawing some power from the outlet because there's a 25-cent shutoff diode that would stop that the manufacturer is electing not to install into the product because they don't pay the energy bills. So they have no benefit. So we just say, no, you can't sell the product into the California market without that. And that alone saves $300 million a year. So a lot of this is very, very below the radar, but really important to reducing emissions. So one point I want to make is that as a country, we are actually terrible at projecting the growth of clean energy. This is the annual energy outlook projection of the growth of solar from the US government. And here's what actually happened. We're really much better at growing clean energy markets than predicting the growth of clean energy markets. And that's something that holds true up until today. Important to note as well that today, most of the power being added to the electric grid in the United States is clean. And most of the power that's being retired is dirty. And so, typically coal power is coming offline, wind and solar are coming online. And, even for people like President Trump, an ardent supporter of coal power, more coal power got retired under President Trump than under President Obama, just because coal's not economic. And so the grid is getting cleaner. And it's really important to note, the future of our climate strategy and the future of our economy is going to run through wires principally and not pipes. The electric grid is really ascendant as a sort of economic foundation for the country. Coupled with all this is what's happening now with the fossil fuel divestment movement. There's in excess of $40 trillion of assets that have been divested from fossil fuels from institutional investors all over the world, rapid uptick in the last few years. And part of that is because the fossil fuel sector has actually not delivered the same returns or anywhere close to the rest of the S&P 500. There's been a lot of volatility. And so this is an important movement happening as well. I want to take you guys on a little tour of clean energy in California. This is one of my favorite Chinese proverbs, that people who say it can't be done should get out of the way of the people who are doing it. And really hats off to all the innovators who have been making this clean energy future happen. So let's begin with a little tour of California, where all this clean energy is coming from. So this is the world's largest thin film solar photovoltaic project. It's called the Desert Sunlight Project. 550 megawatts in size. That's roughly half of the peak demand of a city like San Francisco. One interesting thing about innovation, when this project was being put in, this is at the very southern end of the state, just north of the border with Mexico. There was all this innovation that occurred just during the construction of the project. So all the panels that were put in for this project, at least for the first part of the project, had an aluminum frame. And they figured out halfway through the installation, actually, we don't need that frame. So they eliminated that. And there's a cost savings there. The early versions of these installations, they actually did concrete piers, and they subsequently figured out how to just use a metal pier that's just vibrated into the soil. Much less energy use and much less cost. And then this project is a fixed tilt project, so the solar does not actually track the sun because the efficiency of the solar panel is not high enough to justify that extra cost. They got the efficiency up to that point, and pretty much after this project, all of the utility scale solar projects are on trackers. It's called a horizontal single axis tracker, and it just tracks the sun as it moves across the sky. You get about 25% more electricity from that. And so just an example of the types of innovation that are happening here as we drive the cost of solar down. And today in California, the single lowest cost source of new electricity for utilities is solar power. We're also home to the world's largest geothermal plant. This is the geysers up in Napa and Lake County, about 2 hours north of San Francisco. And the world's largest solar roof. This is the Apple headquarters, a 17 megawatt solar roof. Just to give you a sense of scale, the hallway when you walk around this donut ring is 1 mile. And so you could actually fit the entire San Francisco 49ers stadium inside that donut hole. What you see in the middle there are actually fruit trees. Apple's put pear and plum and apricot trees in the middle for their employees. And it's the largest curved sheets of glass in the world are on this building. You'll have major building envy when you go to see that headquarters. This is the world's largest battery storage project, also in California, Moss Landing. And that's been a really important part of our strategy, is to add energy storage, particularly as you're decarbonizing the electric grid and adding more sources of power, some sources of renewable power like geothermal or hydro generating power 24/7, but wind and solar are more intermittent, and therefore energy storage becomes really important. And so we've had a very, very big focus on adding energy storage in California. It's really the fastest growing energy storage market in the world. We had only 250 megawatts of utility owned energy storage in 2019. And last month we hit 5,000 megawatts. So again, that's about 5 San Francisco's worth of peak load on the grid. And we're going to go to 15,000 by the end of the decade. This is the world's largest solar thermal tower power plant. So the way this works, this is called the Ivanpah project. And this is on the far eastern edge of the state near the border with Nevada. And what you're looking at there is basically 3 550-foot towers with a boiler on top, surrounded by 173,000 heliostat mirrors. The sun hits the mirrors, and then the mirrors concentrate the light on the boiler, and you create steam. So this technology was roughly comparable with solar photovoltaics, maybe 12, 15 years ago. What's happened is solar photovoltaics, the flat plate solar panels, have just continued to come down and down in cost. And so you're not seeing as many of these type of installations anymore. We have also the world's second largest wind project, the Alta Wind Energy Center in Kern County. In California, when you say Kern County, most people think oil because it's our #1 oil producing county in the state. But wind is actually the second biggest taxpayer in that county. And one interesting thing that's happening with wind is what's called repowers, where we've been doing wind for so long, for 30 years, that many of the early versions of the turbines are actually, you can upgrade them. So what they're doing is actually removing some of these towers. So the older ones you see there on the right, they were put in typically in the 80s or early 90s. They're on a lattice structure. And they had, so sometimes birds would perch there, and they had very, very fast rotating blades. So it's about 45 rotations per minute. The new turbines are typically 10 to 12 RPM. And so just as an example of what's possible, this project called Vasco here, they've removed 432 of the small turbines and replaced them with just 34 of the new turbines, and the energy production tripled, while reducing the avian impact. So a good example of what's possible to reduce environmental impacts. A lot of progress as well on transportation electrification, including in heavy duty. So this is the Tesla Semi. This is at the Frito-Lay warehouse in Modesto. This is a vehicle that transports like Pepsi and Cheetos, so all your junk food. 500-mile range, which is more than enough for most of these routes, and can recharge in 2 hours. So I think they're doing about 30 of these vehicles there in Modesto. And also larger and larger scale chargers. This particular installation by Tesla has 98 stalls, EV charging getting bigger and bigger. I think one of the most significant milestones for the clean energy revolution is transportation electrification. And in the middle of COVID, Governor Newsom signed really a historic executive order, which mandated that 100% of new vehicle sales be electric by 2035. And at the time, a lot of people mocked that and said it's not achievable, that it's a pipe dream. But what's happened since then is that Europe has now announced that for all 27 members of the European Union, they'll do the exact same thing: 100% zero emission vehicles sales by 2035. And companies like General Motors have announced they're going all electric by 2035. And really every major automaker in the world is now building electric vehicles. And it is the power of a large market to be able to do that. And I think another example too, where not to listen to the critics, because there's always these naysayers, but in the fourth quarter of 2022, we hit 23% of new vehicle sales being electric. That's double what it was a year earlier. And there's a lot of momentum here, and I'm happy to share the good news that we're going to be doing an event this week, actually, marking California reaching 1.5 million electric vehicles. So a lot of momentum there. And of course, if you look at the automakers, the valuation of the auto industry is really ordered around who is furthest along in electrification. And so, for years growing up, we all talked about the big three, Ford and GM and what used to be Chevy, now is Stellantis. Tesla is far more than all these three combined. It's the most valuable car company in the world, and it's electric and growing fast. They're making about 2,000 electric vehicles a day at California's Fremont Tesla factory. So one of the things that's also a really exciting opportunity here, as we look a little bit further upstream, where does the lithium come from? Right now, the lithium in all these electric vehicle batteries comes from principally 4 countries: Chile and Argentina, where it's produced with these evaporation ponds, and China and Australia, where it's hard rock mining. California has a huge resource of lithium in the form of a geothermal brine, which is at the southern end of the state in the Imperial County. And the governor here, pictured about a month ago, visiting this region, which we're calling Lithium Valley, is really lifting up this vision of producing lithium here. And it's a very, very low impact way to produce it, because you're just cycling the brine, and there's a way to get the lithium out, and then the brine is reinjected back into the underground reservoir. So to produce 20,000 tons of lithium, if you do it from South America evaporation ponds, you're impacting 30,000 acres. If you do it from hard rock mining in China and Australia, you're impacting 3,000 acres. If you do it from California, the brine resource, you're impacting 30 acres. So really green process, and it's all powered by 100% clean geothermal power, because that's what that geothermal brine produces. Another big resource to help create the electricity we're going to need for all of these electric vehicles is offshore wind. So this has been a really exciting project we've been working on for now 7 years. We just set the state goal at 25 gigawatts, which is enough to power 25 million homes. And in December, in partnership with the Biden administration, the very first offshore wind lease sale occurred. So it's 583 square miles off the central and the north coast for offshore wind development, which, unlike the East Coast, which has a shallow water shelf, the offshore wind that's going in California is in deep water. And so the difference is, if you look on the left, those installations in shallow water, the foundation is right in the seabed and it's fixed. The waters off the west coast of the United States are deep. So what you do is you have a floating structure, which is typically a tripod structure, and then you have 3 high tension cables that hold it in place. And so that's what we're going to be doing. And just to give you a sense of like the scale of these things, one rotation of one of these turbines, and then, like I said, it's typically 10 to 12 rotations a minute. So one rotation powers 2 homes for a day. So that's how much juice is coming off of these systems, really, really large scale. And, again, what you can do offshore is much larger installations than what's possible on land. When you drive around the United States and you see wind turbines, they're typically, maybe 1 to 2 megawatts in size. Offshore wind is closer to 15 megawatts in size. Another great installation is a factory company called Beam, which I visited last week, which is providing electricity in a way that you can charge your car, but you don't need to be connected to the grid. So what you're looking at there is a device that basically is designed to fit in a single parking space, a 10,000-pound ballast metal plate connected to an arm which holds up a battery pack and a solar tracker. And so that fills up the battery from the sun, and then there's 2 electric vehicle chargers there. And you don't need to trench, you don't need a permit, you don't need to interconnect. You can just plop this in a parking space and you get power 24 hours a day to charge your car, even when there's a grid outage. So all this stuff that we're doing, we've been criticized as this is going to be bad for the economy. Investing in renewables is a mistake. And we've been hearing that for years, okay, just the last decade. But here's what's happened is we've gone big on clean energy. We were the 10th largest economy in the world, and then we passed Russia, we passed Italy, become number 8. Then we ended up passing Brazil and France to become number 6, and then we passed the United Kingdom to be number 5, and now we're on track this year in 2023 to pass Germany to be the 4th largest economy in the world. And so we're really, I think it's really clear that clean energy has been good for our economy. We've attracted a lot of new investment and a lot of innovation, and then been able to export. One of our largest exports of all is electric vehicles. We have 43 facilities manufacturing electric vehicles in California. So Tesla being the biggest, as I mentioned, they're manufacturing about 2,000 electric cars a day at the Fremont factory. Tesla employs about 47,000 people in California. They also have a major battery factory. And as I mentioned, they actually represent about 60% of electric vehicle sales in California, although now many other models are coming on. But as I mentioned, we just hit 1.5 million zero emission vehicles sold in California. So this is one of my favorite pictures. This is Fifth Avenue. 1900. You look and it's all horse and buggy in one car, and then 13 years later, same street, all cars and one horse and buggy. And I think it's just a good reminder visually of how quickly transformation can happen faster than conventional wisdom suggests. We're also doing a lot around rooftop solar. So the Energy Commission mandated in 2020 that all new homes have to be built with rooftop solar. There's a couple sort of common sense off ramps we have for that. If you're participating, for example, in a community solar system, you can do that instead. Or if you have shading or a north-facing roof where solar doesn't make sense, you get an exemption. But basically, the default is every new home is built with solar. And then in 2023, we required solar on all new buildings. So schools, commercial, industrial, everything has to have rooftop solar. We build about 100,000 new buildings a year in California, and that's adding about 1 gigawatt of rooftop solar every 2 years, just that part of our energy code. So really what we're doing is the electrification of almost everything. And you see the Ford F-150 Lightning there, electric buses, but also a lot of electric two-wheeled devices. You're seeing those all over California now and across the country. But also all electric new homes. So building a home where you have electric heat pump technology to provide your heat and your cooling and electric induction cooktops, you actually save about $5,000 from not having to run a gas line inside your home. I just visited last week the Port of San Diego, which is the first port in the United States to commit to go 100% electric, and they will be getting the very first electric tugboat in the world in July, and then later this fall, they're going to be doing electric cranes, electric harbor cranes are getting installed. So really exciting to see that happen. And right now, the Caltrain line is electrifying from diesel to electric next year. And of course, high-speed rail is under construction in California as well. That'll be 100% electric and 100% powered by renewables. So to wrap up, I think a really good way to think about this energy transition that we're on and moving beyond fossil fuels is to remember the story of smoking in the United States. So both my grandfathers were in World War II, and men were given as part of daily ration. Soldiers in World War II in the U.S. Army, everybody got food, they got chocolate, and they got a pack of cigarettes. And you had a generation of American men come home as smokers, and it was completely mainstream. Doctors did ads for cigarettes. Johnny Carson smoked on The Tonight Show. Fred Flintstone smoked. Marilyn Monroe smoked. President Kennedy smoked. Some people say they smoked together. So you get that. And then the science came out that, hey, smoking causes cancer, and secondhand smoke causes cancer. And the response from the tobacco industry was very telling, because they went from manufacturing one product, cigarettes, to manufacturing two products. They manufactured cigarettes and they manufactured doubt. They put over $100 million into junk science to distort that basic truth that smoking causes cancer. They came up with all sorts of other bogus explanations for why everybody's getting lung cancer. But what happened next, I think, is very instructive for the climate fight, because ultimately the truth got out and it got accepted that smoking was causing cancer. And it led to a cascade of policies, health warnings on cigarette packages, banning advertisement of cigarettes on TV, increasing the cigarette tax, sales to minors, banning smoking on airplanes and bars and restaurants and so forth. And now we're down to 9%. And it's really one of the great public health success stories in our country's history. And I think it's very analogous actually to a lot of the mythology that the fossil fuel industry has invested in about climate and what's really driving climate change. So to close out, I wanted to just share that I think when I think about how I got into this work, it was really a love of nature from when I was young, and especially at Swarthmore, being able to walk around these beautiful trees in this arboretum really affected me in a beautiful way. And trees have a very special place in my heart. I think there's a lot of wisdom and beauty with trees. And I remember the walk on Parrish, and I'll hopefully be back for my 30th reunion here in a few months. And coming to California, I realized we have an amazing set of trees. We have the oldest tree in the world, the Methuselah tree, which is almost 5,000 years old. And think about a tree that was alive during the time of Cleopatra, Jesus Christ, and so forth. We also have the tallest tree in the world in Humboldt County, the Hibernian tree, almost 400 feet tall. And we have the biggest by volume, which is the only one of those I've seen. This is in Sequoia National Park, the General Sherman tree. And if any of you have not had a chance to go to Sequoia, I highly, highly recommend it. At the foot of this tree, you'll see there are these cones. They're about the size of an egg. It's the cone that this sequoia produces, and you open it up, and there are little seeds there that are about the size of a grain of rice. And I was very moved by this. I took my girls and my wife, and just looking up at this amazing tree and realized that something so big starts so small was very moving and inspiring to me. And I think that's how we have to think about the change we can create in the world, that little actions add up. So anyways, I will stop there and happy to take questions. Thanks for having me.
Thanks so much, David, for that great chat. And it's really, I think, inspiring to hear about all the work and all the superlatives associated with the energy policy in California, for sure. Just to get us started here, it's really interesting to kind of think about industrial policy, especially in a domain where not only the goalpost but the entire field is shifting rapidly. You gave a bit of a rise to some of the work going on with lithium, and of course, all of the social, environmental, as you mentioned, national security challenges there. And just last week, one of the inventors of the lithium battery said it was due for disruption. But at the same time, it's what we have right now and what we can move forward on. And so how do we really manage industrial policy in a space where things are rapidly changing and where we have to invest significant amount of dollars in order to act now and meet the urgency?
Well, first of all, I want to begin just by giving hats off to the Biden administration. I think this has been the most productive first 2 years of any presidential administration since Roosevelt. And the two big bills that got passed, really three, the Infrastructure Act and the Inflation Reduction Act and the CHIPS Act, all have major pieces for climate. The most significant being the Inflation Reduction Act, which provides 10 years of tax credits for solar, for wind, for geothermal, for electric vehicles, for energy storage, for electric heat pumps. And that's a runway that we've never had before. If you look at how we subsidize energy, typically, fossil fuels have been, the oil depletion allowance started in 1926 and continues to this day for a fully mature industry. We've only had very spare and very intermittent tax credits for renewables. And so finally, we have some wind at our backs, thanks to President Biden and Congress for getting that over the finish line. That will really help with our industrial strategy. So I think industrial strategy and climate policy are really inextricably intertwined. I think our lesson from California is that it's good for business to do this. And we don't want to be in a situation where China becomes the Saudi Arabia for clean energy. We want to be producing these resources here and scaling up. And there's a lot of tax policy now to help make that possible.
So it seems like there's a lot of excitement both domestically and then also within the state. Out of curiosity, are there bright spots for you and other places that inspire you with respect to their energy policy?
Absolutely. I mean, I mentioned offshore wind. We're ahead on a bunch of these things like rooftop solar and electric vehicles, but we're way behind Europe on offshore wind. And you look at the UK, for example, they have 10 gigawatts. Our peak load in California is 50 gigawatts. They already have 10 gigawatts of offshore wind installed today, and they will have 50 installed by 2030. So they're going to get the majority of their electricity from offshore wind, and they're moving really fast. And we have a lot to learn from our partners over there. And that's the beautiful thing, by the way, when you travel around the world. And I just came back from a climate delegation to Japan. There's all these exchanges, and a place like Japan is way ahead on energy efficiency and electric heat pumps and rail, but way behind on renewables. And we can have constructive changes, exchanges. And I think there's I think a very healthy competition to who can be first in clean energy that we want to encourage.
Yeah, well, we have a few questions here on on some of the technical aspects of a more efficient U.S. power grid. And so one of the questions here from Michael or Michelle is, how important is building the equivalent of the Eisenhower freeway system for a more efficient U.S. power grid? And I guess that gets maybe even to what Buckminster Fuller had called for back in the day for even a world energy grid. So curious about your thoughts there.
Well, good. First of all, I'm relieved that wasn't one of my classmates. I have a couple classmates listening in. I thought they were going to be asking me why was my dorm room such a mess and so forth. Yeah, so I think we do need a lot more transmission in the United States to help get clean energy resources from one place to another. And that's a major focus of the Biden administration and of our work here in California. For example, offshore wind is an amazing resource. It is actually producing a lot more power for more hours of the day than wind that's produced on land. And we would like to be able to export that throughout the Western United States. And so that does require more transmission. That's a great infrastructure opportunity and a great jobs opportunity to build all that out. So that's a big part of what we need to do.
And can you speak a little bit about storage as well as, and maybe also various technologies like fuel cell technology?
So energy storage, as I mentioned, is a major focus for us. That's been almost entirely lithium chemistry, and it's typically 4-hour storage capacity. So it can dispatch for 4 hours, which is actually largely sufficient because, just to be clear on grid reliability, it's only like 30 plus hours a year where we're actually concerned about grid reliability. It tends to be late afternoon, early evenings in August and September when the heat is really high. And we had a sustained heat storm in September that really stressed the grid, and storage was a key part of what kept the lights on. But we are also investing in other non-lithium chemistries that they're called long duration storage. So it's vanadium and iron chromium and zinc air and iron air chemistries that have the potential to go to 100 hours or more. And so that's an important piece of the puzzle as well.
Yeah. Well, we have a few questions that are bubbling up really on the social dimensions as well, in addition to the technical. And I suppose given that decarbonization and electrification is really happening on a massive scale, such that it almost becomes de facto social policy. For instance, touching environmental justice, where pollution and vulnerable communities are concerned, employment, given growth and transition, and then environmental policy writ large, even beyond energy, as it affects wildlife and biodiversity. Can you talk a little bit about how within your remit and within I suppose the state agency, that those conversations end up being surfaced?
Yeah, so equity is really at the heart of the energy strategy and the climate strategy in California. We're making a commitment to really prioritize the communities that have borne the heaviest burden of pollution. So, for example, we're doing about $1 billion this year for building electrification. We're focusing that on low-income and disadvantaged communities. When we do demonstration projects for new clean energy technologies, including carbon removal and others, we prioritize low-income communities. So about 70% of our demonstration projects are going into low-income communities for these clean energy projects. And there's a special focus on tribes. California has 109 federally recognized Native American tribes in our state. We've funded 8 tribal microgrids, and we have plans to do another 16. So these are solar battery microgrids. Typically, tribes in California are the first to lose power and the last to get it back because they're in very remote areas. And so when you have a windstorm or fires, the time that it takes to make those repairs is longer. And we really wanted to address that directly with microgrids, which can be a great solution. We just came back from a bunch of tribal consultations up in the North Coast with the Yurok and Blue Lake Rancheria and a number of other tribes. And these tribes are losing power sometimes 8 to 10 times a year. And microgrids can be a big help to them in ensuring grid reliability. So that's a big focus for us.
Well, it seems like equity is I'm really appreciating the way that it's found its way into the conversation. Say, for instance, initially when a lot of rebates rolled out for electric cars, et cetera, only for the first purchaser, and now increasingly a conversation where it's passing on to the used market, as well as with some of the recent passages of major bills at the federal level. Um, so equity, it seems like, meets the needs then of a lot of folks within the community and goes beyond, I suppose, middle and upper class traditional foci of these policies. And so do you find that there ends up being backlash either from working class folks or otherwise on the technical side as well with these clean energy initiatives?
Well, I think the incentive programs, when they're targeted low income, are generally well received. And it is true that, just like cell phones, for example, which initially were very, very expensive before becoming basically ubiquitous, that's also kind of the trajectory many of these clean energy technologies have started with. And so rooftop solar used to be initially just for the wealthy. It's now fully mainstream. And there's all sorts of credits and so forth to help make it even more affordable for low income. Electric vehicles as well. One of the things we're seeing is the development of a secondary market. So you can get a used Nissan Leaf electric car for $6,000 or $7,000 now, and shorter range again, but that's becoming more and more accessible. It does highlight the point that we need public charging infrastructure really on that piece. And so we're putting, my agency alone is doing about $3 billion of investment just to build out electric vehicle charging. We're targeting about half of that for low income communities. We need to get to about just over 1 million chargers by 2035.
Well, it's one of the questions we have coming up here is on major scientific breakthroughs. And in recent months, regarding the materials used, lithium was kind of due for an upheaval, and some folks want to know a little bit more about your take on kind of transitioning beyond it.
I'm sorry, I missed that. Transition beyond what?
Beyond lithium itself as a technology.
Yeah, so there is talk of other chemistries. Sodium is the one that's gotten some attention lately. I think, honestly, there's always going to be a lot of sound and fury about future chemistries. I think lithium is to batteries what silicon is to solar. And I come out of the solar industry, and there was, a lot of discussion about other chemistries, cadmium telluride and gallium arsenide and thin film amorphous, all this stuff. But, silicon has been the mainstay, resource to support solar. And it's, I think, 98% of the solar market today. And I think, lithium has great properties, including energy density that really make it very attractive. So I think it is going to be a mainstay technology for a long time, and the costs are coming down. The energy density is getting better. Welcome competition. We will always be investing in other chemistries, but I think lithium is working well and coming down in price. And as we get more scale, that'll only continue.
And out of curiosity, within the remit of the Energy Commission, does it end up also simultaneously investing in research into these technologies, or is that handled separately?
Yeah, we have really, after the Department of Energy's R&D program, the California Energy Commission is the biggest in the country. We do about $150 million a year of research and development, and that's for everything from next generation battery technologies, companies like Sparks that we've funded that are making a cobalt-free, nickel-free lithium-ion battery, so you can make a lithium battery entirely with materials from California, to high-efficiency windows, LED lighting, better solar and wind technologies, a better demand response technology. So we fund all sorts of that. And those early grants really matter. I was with the CEO of a battery company recently who just got acquired and got a $100 million investment. But he told us we might have given him $1 million or $2 million grant. He said that bridge funding was what saved the company. They were going to go bankrupt. and this is a company called Qberg in Hayward. And to hear those stories, that's what it's about. I mean, I think that's a really that's people ask, like, what is the role of government in this? And I think the early stage stuff where it's higher risk, where the market's not quite ready to support yet, that is where public dollars are needed. And then you give it a push, and it's a snowball rolling downhill. It'll carry on its own. But that early push is, I think, a critical role for us to play.
Yeah, it reminds me of some of the work of Mariana Mazzucato. His text, "The Entrepreneurial State," really shows how states can effectively be involved in entrepreneurship and early stage investment that drive those markets. And it's really interesting to see too how y'all invest in research at such a scale that it's only second to DoD. But a lot of those, I suppose, tools end up revolving and still around the core of market-based principles. And I'm just kind of curious. There's a question here that is curious about the effectiveness of carbon pricing and reducing demand as opposed to for fossil fuels. And I'm just kind of curious, how does that end up playing in the electrification?
I think that's been, a very lively debate over the last 10, 15 years, is how do you best move us towards clean energy? And the decision was made, really by the last Congress and the Biden administration. Instead of adding a price to carbon, let's cut the costs of clean energy. So this is really sort of strategy that's laden with carrots. And I think that can be quite effective because essentially, what you're doing when you provide, like, for example, with batteries, right? So you get a 30% tax credit when you install, say, a battery storage system, if you're a company or you're a home. And then if it's domestic content, it's 40%. If it's domestic manufacturing, it's 50%. That really creates a market. And that becomes much more cost effective than dirtier alternatives. So I think, politically, what's happened is really become clear that this was the sort of pathway that could work politically. So that's really the story, I think, of the last year since the Inflation Reduction Act was adopted.
Yeah, it's incredible seeing the amount and the scale of private capital flowing in as a result of those policies. One of the examples or one of the ideas in the book that I had mentioned just now, The Entrepreneurial State, gave an example of, well, if the US in early stage investment at the national level had asked for a 1% stake in any of the companies in which it provide early investment dollars, that revenue would provide for the entire US budget. And so I'm just kind of curious, even as that still relies on the same fundamental carrots that you're talking about, do you think that there is political bandwidth to kind of implement some of these ideas where essentially we have not necessarily a universal basic income, but really a universal basic dividend?
That is a very bold idea, and kind of above my pay grade in my current job. But there are definitely some efforts along those lines that Governor Newsom has set up. Some loan programs you can have access to, but there are repayment triggers if you have a successful exit. So the money goes back to the Treasury. It's not so much that it goes to every individual and you have a check going out to individuals, but more that it goes back to the public coffers to make more public investments. But one could envision something like the clean energy version of the Alaska Permanent Fund, where they have, every Alaskan gets a check every year for a couple $1,000s from oil revenues, and you could envision something like that for clean energy.
Well, as Linda here mentioned, really kind of thankful for the chat, and also wanted to echo, I think, a lot of your stories about cultural change. It's a really swatty approach to hear that the chair of the Energy Commission also happened to work with Mandela and led a lot of voter initiatives as well. It's a story we're really glad to hear. They were mentioning actually that they were at Swarthmore about 10 years before you in the class of 82. And at that time, students were infuriated by the slow pace of divestment from South Africa.
Yeah,
But 10 years later, as you mentioned, and you give the example with the horses and the electric cars, it was a complete sea change of approach. And so, just recently, Swarthmore, and much to its credit, launched an impressive initiative to decarbonize by 2035. And out of curiosity, given that that's where we set the carrot now, 10 years down the road, where do you hope we will be?
well, look, first of all, I will say, just as an alumni, I do hope Swarthmore divests from fossil fuels. I will tell you, living in South Africa, it was crystal clear that divestment from the apartheid government was the political force that drove the end of apartheid and made it possible for Mandela to end that racist system and to become president. And institutions like Swarthmore were part of that. And I was fortunate at an alumni event a few years back to meet some of the alumni who were involved in that, which, there was occupation of the president's office and big debate, but Swarthmore was on the right side of history there. And they did divest and, very much in the tradition of our school being, a stop on the Underground Railroad. I mean, there are these moral moments, and Swarthmore showed up during the divestment debate for apartheid. With the fossil fuel divestment movement, which, as I mentioned, is now really taken off and in excess of $40 trillion of assets being divested. That movement for divestment from campuses actually did begin with Swarthmore students. It didn't happen. Swarthmore is not yet divested from fossil. But I think, the interesting thing about this debate is, fossil fuel represents about 5% of investable assets. So it's not a big fraction of the economy. So you can divest 100% from fossil fuel and still be able to invest in 95% of the economy, which, it has not performed as well over the last 10, 15 years as the rest of the S&P 500. So I don't actually think it's a sound investment strategy. And I think the legwork necessary to divest is actually not that significant because it's really not a very big portion of the economy as it once was. Used to be bigger than 10%, and now it's half that. So I do hope that's something that the leadership will look at. I think it's time. I think we're in a moment right now where climate is the defining issue of our era. And in my hometown, I live now in Berkeley with my family, and I grew up here in the Bay Area. We never had wildfire smoke in the Bay Area my whole life. I'm 51. And then we've had it 3 years in a row. And last year we had a day where the wildfire smoke was so thick that it was dark as night in the middle of the day. Street lights went on. And so it's really unprecedented impacts and hurting air quality and driving a lot of public health issues. So I don't think anybody can or should be on the sidelines in ways large and small in this. And I hope Swarthmore really looks at that issue again closely.
Thanks so much, David. And it's not, as you mentioned, not only the moral imperative, but as you mentioned throughout your entire talk, an incredible amount of opportunity there as well to invest in the transformation. And I think really great to know that Swati is a leading light, literally and figuratively, over there in California, helping to lead the way. And thanks so much for joining us tonight and sharing a lot more about your work.
Well, thanks for having me, Saba. Have a good night, everybody.
Take care.